to abandon ship.
Oh no!
Here we go!
Can I persuade you to join us for a drink? It's a tradition.
Here, here.
Jar Jar, homie, my main man, quickly. Before the Separatists attack, get into the escape pod.
Hey! This is escape, then we're the pod.
All right, welcome back to Star Wars Escape Pod. We got a very special guest on the show today, and also a returning guest as well. And we are chatting about a fantastic book by the name of The Psychgeist of Pop Culture, The Mandalorian, Jessica E. Tompkins, PhD, as well as Molly Brizzell. And we're going to be chatting with them about this awesome piece here, and just in general, just the characters of The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba, all of what have so much to offer in terms of rich and deep stuff. So we'll get into that. Stay tuned.
Another happy landing.
All right, welcome back, Jess.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I gotta say, I love your intro song and all of the little quotes from Star Wars. It just brought like a huge smile to my face, and I feel so hyped right now.
Oh, thanks. That's awesome. That's literally like 100% of the intention behind it. So yeah, thank you for that. And welcome back, Molly.
Thank you. It's so good to be back. I had such a great time last time, and now we actually get to talk about The Mandalorian and Boba Fett too, of course. So
totally,
I'm ready for another great chat.
Yeah, of course. Yes, thanks so much for coming back on. And what brings us together today is this fantastic book that's been edited by you, Jess. And I was wondering if you could just maybe just talk a little bit about the origin of you becoming a Boba Fett fan, and then by extension a fan of The Mandalorian and these characters, and then we can hear from you, Molly, about what makes you such a big Mandalorian fan as well. But I was wondering if you could just kick things off, and to anyone listening at home, just kind of get a sense of where you're coming from, having put this project together.
Of course, yeah, I love that. Origin stories are always so much fun, especially when talking about fandom. So for me, grew up in an era where, it was in the, I grew up as a 90s kid, and Star Wars films were re-released in theaters, and I do remember, I have memories of going to the theater and watching them, but for some reason or another, I wasn't really really hooked into Star Wars until the films came out on DVD when I was around 15 or 16. And so my brother and I got the box set of the DVD when the films were released in that format for the first time. And I guess I was old enough to recognize what was actually going on in the plot and the characters at that age. And seeing Boba Fett in Empire Strikes Back, it was just an immediate wow, of course he looks so cool, but also I want to learn more about him. And I remember being disappointed that he just died so quickly and had such limited screen time. So when you're someone who wants to learn more about a character, you typically, do your typical, I'm going to go looking for more information on the internet. And this was, of course, pre-Disney acquisition, so I learned that there were a number of books out there about Boba Fett that were written in the 90s, like Tales of the Bounty Hunters and the Boba Fett book trilogy, where, Boba's story was expanded, and I learned that he survived the Sarlacc, and there was so much more to him than we saw in the films, possibly more there than just a guy in a cool looking suit of armor. And so I basically read everything that I could about Boba Fett and learned that he wasn't just a character that looked cool, but was kind of like this morally gray individual in a universe that was otherwise pretty much black and white with the dark side and good side. And I just, for some reason, kind of gravitated towards this individual, out of the entire cast of Star Wars heroes and villains. Like, this more ambiguous and morally gray individual was the one that just, I guess, excited my imagination the most in terms of like, storytelling potential, and also, what his motivations are, like what is driving him as a bounty hunter. And yeah, just really soaked up everything that I could, and just enjoyed the way that Boba's character was portrayed in the books, having his own sort of code of justice, his own sort of rationalizations for like doing the work that he did, and continued to be a Fett fan. It just was something that always stuck with me, is being a fan of his character. And, over time, his story has changed, right? Attack of the Clones came out, and a lot of his story was retconned. We all, I don't want to belabor that point, because I'm sure everyone listening knows that already, but his past has been retconned a few times. And then the Disney acquisition, we all know a lot of that previous canon was, of course, either, essentially turned into legends or modified into the new canon. And, now we have Boba Fett's new history, in terms of what is told after the events of the Sarlacc with Book of Boba Fett. And I know, some fans were a little underwhelmed with that show, but I, in my chapter in the book, the Psychgeist of the Mandalorian, I wrote about Boba Fett, and I wrote about his motivations and his character development on the Book of Boba Fett. And it was really the second time watching the show that I actually grew more fond of his character development and his overall portrayal on the show. And happy to expand on that later. I can understand why fans especially, were a bit underwhelmed by Book of Boba Fett, but I think there's a lot more when you start unpacking it on a psychological level. Like digging into his past and how that has shaped his actions as an adult who has endured a lot of trauma, and is experiencing healing potentially for the first time in his life on Book of Boba Fett. Once you start sort of examining that, I think at more of a psychological level, a lot of his character development starts to make more sense. So TLDR, just initially really into Boba Fett just based on how he looks. Always found his morally gray identity more interesting than the black and white characterizations of like the dark side and the light side. And I think he has a lot of character development that I think unfortunately is kind of dismissed as maybe bad storytelling. And maybe part of that has to do with execution, but overall, I think his character development is pretty interesting and lines up and makes sense psychologically as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Book of Boba certainly got a little more heat than it deserved. But that's great to hear. I mean, that also that you I assume you enjoyed it.
I mean, the first time I watched it, I was definitely in the camp of a bit disappointed with certain scenes, expected Boba to behave a little differently. Yeah. Happy to expand on that later. Also, definitely had my grievances when Din Djarin took up a significant amount of screen time on Boba Fett's own show. So, I get it. I think the criticisms are mostly fair, but the second time I watched it, which was, I took a ton of notes when writing this book chapter on Boba Fett's nature and nurture, and suddenly, things started clicking a bit more, and I had more appreciation for it the second time around.
Gotcha. All right. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. And Molly, I know you're a huge Mandalorian fan. The last time we spoke to you was on Galactic Starcruiser, and never really had a chance to ask you about, what drives you as a Star Wars fan and why you love The Mandalorian so much. I think maybe you touched up on it a little bit, but, this episode's the episode to really just like dive in and share all that, what makes you a hardcore Mandalorian fan. So yeah, what drives you as a Star Wars fan to The Mandalorian and these characters?
Yeah, well, maybe by the end of this, you'll wish you haven't asked. But so very similarly, I was definitely always a Star Wars kid. I was very much a child of the prequels, meaning like I was born during the prequel era. So my earliest memories of Star Wars were all rooted in, the Clone Wars and the prequel era and just everything that had to do with that. And of course, the big figures during that prequel era are the clones. And my dad is a huge Star Wars fan. He's definitely the one who's like held my hand through my entire Star Wars fandom experience. But then I also had an older brother, and so lots of Star Wars video games around the house. And so one game I would play coming home from kindergarten is Star Wars Battlefront, and I'm playing as clone troopers. So in that way, I've always been really endeared to Star Wars characters who are like helmeted figures, which I feel like is a really weird kind of niche. But I don't know, like that was just something that clicked for me. So I love the clone troopers. Of course, grew up a little bit catching some episodes of the Clone Wars, but I had a busy enough childhood I couldn't catch all of them. So fast forward and we get the sequel movies, and those were super exciting for me. Of course, everybody has their views on it and professional critiques, but just as somebody who was like a teenager during the time, I just loved having Star Wars again. And then Disney Plus was announced, and this Star Wars show is going to like define the Disney Plus kind of like the era. And I was like, well, a Star Wars show sounds really cool. I haven't really thought of anything. I didn't know Rebels was coming out yet at the time, or had already been coming out. And so I'm like, Star Wars TV, that's brand new for me. And my dad and I were constantly talking about any updates about this show called The Mandalorian, whatever. And I remember early on thinking, oh, like, I wonder if this Mandalorian is Boba Fett, which I'm sure I think a lot of other people thought the same thing initially. It was like, what if it's revealed that it's actually Boba or something? Right. But leading into it, I just kept getting more and more excited. And I was also very excited about the idea of like the Clone Wars being on Disney Plus, so I could finally watch that and stuff. It was just a lot of my whole life of being a Star Wars fan began to culminate with this. Mm-hmm. And then the Mandalorian came out on Disney Plus, and I had definitely remembered seeing the trailers were huge. I was hooked on those. And then the night before, or like 2 days before, they released the opening scene in the cantina with the fight. And that was like, I was like, whoa, this is going to be good. Like, this is going to be a gritty Star Wars show. And I sat down, watched that episode, and just everything clicked for me. And it was before Grogu showed up. Of course, I saw Baby Yoda at the end, and I had the reaction everybody does, which is, oh my gosh, it's a Baby Yoda. And I was obsessed. But even before then, I remember everything really fell into place for me. And I was like, this is a show and a character I want to follow. When Din started talking about no droids and then had his flashbacks, like it very much set him up as a complicated character that I was like, well, this is a guy who's really cool in action, but like there's more to him than meets the eye. And as a storyteller myself for a really long time, complex characters are my favorite things. Or just not even like, you don't have to be super complex, but just characters that are way more than meets the eye, and they have this depth. And so I became very attached to his character and his relationship to Grogu, especially as somebody who, has in the Star Wars world has that kind of relationship with my dad, is like kind of like he guides me through and whatnot. So watching it with him and then watching this relationship, it was like very much the parallels for me. So I became very attached to it, and I just every week I couldn't wait to watch it. And then by the end of season 1, I knew I was locked in, very much so. And my love for it has only grown over time, especially with season 2. I was finally waking up at 3 a.m. before they decided they wanted to do the 9 p.m. Eastern time premieres. So I've done my time in the 3 a.m. trenches for The Mandalorian, and also for the Book of Boba Fett. Especially once I knew that Din was going to be coming. I did not expect that takeover, so I'm very sorry, Jess. But I could say at least we kind of got some of our karma in season 3 a little bit with the one episode. And then like Bo-Katan kind of having more of her spotlight too, which I think is great as a side note. But I was like, okay, you know what? I'll take this as payback for what we did to the Book of Boba Fett. But yeah, that's and a lot of that, I'm sure, too, my fascination with The Mandalorian and with Mando in particular had to do back with that history with helmeted figures and clone troopers. Just something about like that image was very nostalgic for me and like oddly comforting because it reminded me so much of that past. So I don't know. I love the story. I am really excited we're getting a movie, but I'm a little sad it's going to be 2 more years until we see it. But yeah, that's kind of just been my journey, really. And then that all season 1 spiraled me into once again connecting with all the deeper tissue of Star Wars in terms of the animated shows, and then books, comics, everything else. All was really started when The Mandalorian started. So I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm very glad you put it that way too about helmeted figures. There's something very fascinating about what draws us to these characters that don't necessarily have a face, and we're looking at something else on the outside, and you know, but this because you can tell there's always so much emotion on the inside. But I think what makes it easy to relate to a character like this is that they don't have a face on the outside. You know, like it could be anyone under there, and yeah, definitely. And the way you describe Star Wars coming back, I mean, oh man, that brings me back. I don't think about it often enough, but I think I'm between the two of you where in age where when Force Awakens came out, I'd already kind of just finished like my high school career and everything, and was sort of just in the workforce, and I remember like seeing trailers and stuff for the movie, and you know, say what you will about the films, of course, as you said, you know, they've had critiques over the years and we all have our opinions, but there was just something that lingers from that period of time, which was Star Wars is back. And that was the takeaway. And that's, I think, been the takeaway from these movies, is that they are still responsible for bringing us new Star Wars stories, and you know, tales like The Mandalorian have been able to be, I guess, a thing, you know, branching off of the relaunch of this IP and this title under the Disney banner, and we've had some fantastic stories like The Mandalorian and Andor, and you know, so many other things. So it's great, and Book of Boba too. I mean, like, definitely getting into this zeitgeist of the Mandalorian. You know, really, I've never really had a sore spot for Book of Boba by any means at all, but this really did help me a lot, sort of, I guess, embrace what they did with the character, if you know what I mean, Jess. You know, like, because I think I'm with you in the sense that, like, we both have sort of experienced this, like, other history to the character, and, you know, had our own ideas for, like, kind of what he should be, and then transforming that character in the show into a different entity, in a way, based on his traumatic life and his experiences and stuff, was a curious story choice, but I just love how it's unpacked here. And I also just want to thank you again for sending me a copy of this. I've read it cover to cover, and it's been really, truly fantastic. You know, some of the stuff has
thank you.
Unlocked a part of my brain.
I'm so glad to hear that you enjoyed it. And, you know, I think when you write a book like this, you put it out there in the world, you hope it's going to be well received. And to hear that, it's really heartwarming. So thank you. You know, it is a book that is more academic in nature, so it's not, you know, really ever going to be like a bestseller necessarily, right? It has these academic undertones, and the goal was to make it accessible for anyone, whether you have a pre-existing knowledge of psychology and psychological theories or not. So I hope that was the goal, but it can be difficult to translate some of these things for a more general audience. But I'm glad to hear that it resonated with you. I really appreciate you saying that. I think the last time I checked, you know, it is available for free as a digital download, which was something that I'm really proud of, that ETC Press supports the publisher for the Psychgeist series. I'm actually looking at the webpage now. Total downloads is nearly 800. We're a little less than 20 downloads away from 800 total downloads of the PDF version of the book. So
that's amazing.
And we came out in January. End of January is when we launched the book. So it is available in paperback or digital download. I love the spirit of, you know, just providing knowledge for free to the benefit of fans.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm you know, totally with you there. I mean, you know, this is like an unmonetized unsupported financially podcast. So, I mean, I totally get that mentality. Absolutely. Just like giving back to the fandom, but yeah, I'll put a link in the description, 100% to that book. And, so people can check it out and grab a PDF copy or order a physical copy or whatever. So yeah, but yeah, thank you again for that. This has 12 chapters or should I call them essays?
Sure, essays works.
Yeah, and all the authors in this book, they're all it's among yourself, of course. There's a lot of like doctors, right? Is everyone in here a doctor or a few of them?
I think for the most part, everyone does have a PhD in psychology or media psychology or another adjacent field like sociology. Those sort of disciplines. So that is an artifact of my network, to be fair. When I was doing the call for papers, I went to Twitter or X, where a lot of my followers, because I spent so much time in academia before joining the games industry, a lot of my followers on Twitter or X are from the academic sphere, and that is my primary way of kind of staying in touch with some of those ties that I have in academia. So the initial call for papers went out on that platform, and it just reached a lot of my colleagues who are doing psychological or related research, media studies, cultural studies, so on and so forth. So if folks don't have a PhD, they're probably very close to getting one. We did have a few grad students participate. Mm-hmm.
That's impressive that so many that you got so many back. I mean, I was like when I first picked this up, like on the cover it has your name edited by Jessica, and you have your own chapter in here as well. But I had no idea that there were so many contributors to this project. So that blew me away. How many potential fans, I guess, that are so involved in this academia actually was able to contribute, which is fantastic.
Oh yeah, come on! There's a lot of nerds with PhDs.
yeah, I should have known better. I see. I'm not that smart, so
No, I'm just teasing.
No, that's. So, did you help them write any of these? Was there any communication with them about just like the subject that they were going to tackle, or how did that work exactly?
Yeah, it was very collaborative. So with the call to papers, it went out with initial, basically, spiel of this is the book, here's the objective of the book, here's some potential areas where I'm looking for contributors to cover different characters or themes, kind of as suggestions or inspirational ideas. People, read the call, sent me an abstract, basically kind of pitching, here's what I have in mind, here's what I would like to cover in my book chapter. And once I sort of curated the essays and contributors that I thought would be most appropriate for the book, as well as provide a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds, then I would work. It was very collaborative with the contributors. So they'd send me, there was the first draft, I would provide feedback, maybe make a few edits, add for clarification or expansion in certain areas, maybe providing more examples throughout their chapters. So, and then we would do that 2 or 3 more times in some cases, where they would take my feedback into consideration, keep writing, send it back, and repeat the process until we were good to publish. So end to end, it took us about a year to publish the book. So I think I had curated my list of contributors in January of 2023. And then, throughout the year of 2023 was getting drafts, giving feedback, making edits. There were a couple authors that I did have to work a bit more closely with in terms of helping them think through their pieces and kind of coming out with that final story. It can be admittedly, it's challenging for especially people with an academic background to write for a more general audience. In academia, there's a very specific way that you are writing, and you're writing for other academics, and it tends to be very dry, direct, not very accessible. Let's put it that way in gentle terms. Right. Academic writing, some academic writers are very gifted. And some but they're not super experienced with the more like writing for general audiences, right? So that was a big part of my job as well, was kind of giving the feedback of, this is a bit dense. Please unpack this for a general audience.
Yeah, that's awesome, because general audience is, I think, exactly where I'm coming from with a lot of this. And there were certainly, even still, like areas where I can definitely understand what's going on here, but there were some just sentences which I, unlike reading like a novel where you're kind of just reading what something's saying, like this was very like deep stuff. So it took me a little bit longer, I think, to just like kind of get through a page, because I was really trying to digest just like what this had to say, right? And I got to say, it's been a long time since I've like gone through something so thoughtful. So. Yeah, awesome job.
I get it. I was editing these chapters and sometimes had to reread pages because I would sometimes, that's not what I've come across before, and had to kind of marinate on it. And, but yeah, I think maybe in some cases we were more successful than others in making it accessible. Honestly, some of these chapters probably could have been books in their own right, but we were trying to keep them around 5,000 words a piece. So, with that restriction, in terms of, we wanted to have a breadth of content. So in some cases, there are probably some chapters where easily the thoughts could have been expanded further. But I think overall we were pretty successful in making it not your typical dense, dry academic book, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, absolutely. It was, it was fantastic. There's a few, here's the chapter. I'll just read off like the 12 chapter names. So it starts off with your introduction, and then it goes into Mando with no name, like father, like clone, and that's your piece there. Wonderful non-human beings, the psychology of ownership. Is this the way? He's one of them, a clan of two. Wherever I go, he goes. We're all equal here. Scars on the inside. These people lay ancestral claim to the Dune Sea and memories of Mandalore. So those are all of the pieces in the book, and I love how it starts off with just the very root of Star Wars being the Western influence on the genre, and just in general, like, I think it's pretty, I guess, widely known that some of the things that has influenced George over the years, when he created Star Wars. But I like how it really dives into that, how the influence of Westerns on the shows like The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett have played a bit of a storytelling there. Are you guys big? Are you guys big fan of Western films, or?
I actually learned a lot editing this chapter with Nick Bowman and his co-author Michael. I learned a lot from them, honestly, because Nick's co-author was Koji. My apologies. I was thinking of another chapter. I learned a lot from them because I knew of the Western undertones, and sometimes they're not even undertones, they're overtones. Right. But, I really hadn't examined it as deeply as they had here. So yeah. I learned a lot from them. But I can't say I go out of my way to watch Westerns, honestly.
Yeah, what about you, Molly?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the Western genre. I have to say, one thing about me is I'm horrible at watching anything that isn't like Star Wars related. I'm very much a comfort media person, so I'm going to go back to the same things over and over. But even like growing up, if there was like Western episodes of like shows I watched, like, even like in cartoons or whatever, I was always really fascinated by it, and just kind of like the idea of what a Western is, and like the underlying tropes that are always in Westerns, which is, often sometimes this like morally gray, questionable main character, but there's a soft spot of morality that kind of gets them to like really come into their own as a hero. That's always been really, really fascinating to me. So it's no surprise that when I watched The Mandalorian for the first time, and it was like a huge embodiment of all these Western influences, like that I loved it. And now that I love The Mandalorian, it has given me a much bigger appreciation for the Western in general. So I feel like now I'm more likely to go watch Westerns because I watched this. So going through the Western history was really fascinating. I love to see that in this book, that it's just like, it is really fun to analyze. And for work a lot, for a lot of the things I write at Screen Rant even, the Western is a kind of a big thing I frame my arguments within, or points within, when I'm talking especially about like the Mandalorian and Grogu movie and explaining the title and everything. I've always really referenced the Western a lot to kind of give a comparison point for like what we can expect and whatnot. So I'm definitely more endeared to the Western now than I used to be, but I definitely do enjoy it. And I think the Mandalorian is like what opened the door for me.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I'm with you in that too. I mean, I never grew up being, encouraged to watch Westerns. It was just never really my mom's thing or my dad's thing. It was, but Star Wars has definitely got that Western vibes, and I've certainly opened myself up to Western style media, I guess, since the love for Star Wars in my life. But yeah, I mean, things like, say, like The Revenant or Django, or I don't know, though it's there's another one that's about the Hateful Eight, I think it is. Great movies, and probably which I probably wouldn't have even hit play if it wasn't for having some sort of gateway to the Western genre, being Star Wars. But yeah, it's an interesting I guess idea to have a Western take place in space. I don't know how much of a Toy Story fan you two are, but like Woody and Buzz being these polar opposite style characters for a movie like that. One of them is like this cowboy Western, and it's sort of out with the old, in with the new, which is Buzz Lightyear, who's the space guy, and he's the cool new toy on the block, and it's almost like one kind of replaces the other. And Star Wars has just been this really interesting sort of niche where the two have sort of come together and made something new. And there's not a whole lot of stories out there that have really, I guess, done that in sort of a new, gripping way. And those that have always been compared to Star Wars, I guess, for kind of being the first. Movies like Rebel Moon on Netflix, or maybe like Firefly or something, the show, things like that. They've always had their comparisons to Star Wars in the past. But yeah, so this. Going into your like father like clone piece here, Jess. I mean, have you read? You mentioned you read a few Boba novels over the years, right?
I have. I haven't been keeping up with the current canon, to be honest. It's just something I really haven't set aside to make time for. But in terms of like the literary books,
yeah.
Even the comic books as well. But yeah, I grew up reading like Tales of the Bounty Hunters, the Boba Fett book trilogy, and also like just different Boba Fett comics, like pretty much anything I could get my hands on.
Did you ever read, and I may have asked you this before a while ago when we last chatted, but did you ever read the Boba Fett Scholastic book series? I think there was 5 books in the series or something, and the first one was called A Fight to Survive or something like that.
This was about kid Boba Fett, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
very young Boba. Yeah, I have not. No.
Oh, they were fantastic. I just remember them to be fantastic. Maybe I've been building them in my head a little more than they should be, because I've spent a long time since I've read them. But I remember them to be super awesome, like fantastic stories about Boba Fett. This was, of course, pre Disney Star Wars, long ago, when a lot of this stuff coming out in the EU was just kind of considered by us fans as the canon way, right? And these books really dove into Boba's time in the Clone Wars after his father has died, after Django has been killed on Geonosis. And there was a lot of what you wrote in this piece, and about his traumatic childhood, and the event of the like father like son sort of relationship there, and his nature as a cold-blooded killer, and so many things, and the transformation of that character into something else. I just thought back to this book series a lot, and I don't know, for some reason it just kind of made a connection there, and it's Boba as a kid who's the book series that is really coming to terms with not having his father around to guide him, And inside the helmet, there is like almost like a virtual journal that Jango has left behind for Boba in the event of his death. And it sort of acts as his like North Star in terms of navigating the life of a bounty hunter. And he comes into contact with influences like Aura Singh and Dirge. And at the time, Cad Bane wasn't a character that existed, but these other characters that we're familiar with. He also came into contact with Dooku a few times, and Anakin Skywalker, and this was like basically Boba's childhood story through Star Wars Clone Wars. And then when the Clone Wars 3D animated show came out, a lot of that stuff was, put aside in terms of what actually happened. But yeah, I thought back to this book series that really did have this overarching feeling that Jango was still kind of leading the way for him even after his death and his passing, and the influence of that character in Boba's life and how Boba's sort of becoming something in I guess adjacent to Jango but not exactly the same. He kind of becomes his own character in his own way, and because he's the protagonist of the book series, and it is a kid's book series at the end of the day. It's not like they can make him a cold-blooded killer or anything like that. So,
Right.
but yeah, he did have his like lingering hatred, his desire for revenge on Mace Windu, and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of what kind of drove that character when he was younger. But yeah, I was just wondering, like, can you just share a little bit about maybe your section of this book, like what led you to write about the mercenary who becomes the protector of Mos Espa?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, obviously, going into this, I knew I was going to write a Boba Fett chapter. It just fit my interests extremely well for me to be the contributor in this area. Not to say someone else couldn't have written about Boba Fett too if they wanted to, but I knew going into this, I was going to be the editor, and I also wanted to write a chapter, and naturally, it was going to be about Boba Fett. So, nature and nurture, and actually this idea came from, so Psychgeist is, just a little aside, it is a book series. So the reason it's called Psychgeist of Pop Culture is that there is a broader series that Mandalorian is a part of. The first book in the series is about the Witcher universe, for example. We recently had the psychology or the Psychgeist of Umbrella Academy come out, and there's a bunch more like pop culture books that are very similar to Mandalorian, where it's unpacking these media texts and these characters and these stories through a psychological perspective. And the book series is the editor of the series is Rachel Cohort, and she is a colleague of mine. She actually reached out to me to edit Mandalorian because she knew of me as an academic and knew that I was very passionate about Mandalorian and Mandalorians and Boba Fett and Din Djarin and all of those characters. And she was the one who originally came to me with like, hey, I have this idea for a book in the Psychgeist series on Mandalorian. I think you'd be perfect as the editor, and I think you should totally write about Boba Fett, and probably a good idea for that would be nature and nurture. And so I think I do have to give her credit for the original idea, since she did have her own set of ideas for themes in the book as well as the series editor. And nature and nurture was not something I had ever written about before. Integrating theory, and like my academic background is in media studies, but it's been pretty much squarely through the lens of video games and gender and identity. That's my academic background. So like identity in terms of nature and nurture is not something I had actually studied before at all. But we all grow up with this idea in our head, right? Like we learn about nature and nurture. We are just kind of taught like, hey, who you become as a person is typically shaped by both your environment and genetics. And so thinking about a character like Boba Fett, it's like, it's perfect. Boba Fett's character and his character development is just ripe for talking about this, these processes, these things that shape our identity as individuals. And, with Boba being a clone, he shares his genetic template with Jango Fett. He's going to have certain predilections based off of, what he's inherited from his father slash donor, however you want to put it. But obviously Jango is Boba's father, but it's a little more complicated than that. And but Jango is a force who unfortunately leaves his life, as we were just talking about, much earlier than Boba or Jango probably anticipated. You were talking about how Jango left digital journals for Boba as a precaution, right? If he, in the event of his untimely death.
Yeah.
But I don't think either of them could have foresaw him leaving a very young Boba at like what, 10, maybe 11 years old. He's very young. He's still developing his own identity. He's still becoming his own person. And with Jango out of his life, it not only creates a severely traumatic moment at such a young age, but that also gives him perhaps more room for him to deviate a bit from his father's path and come into more of his own as an individual. And so I thought it was interesting how Book of Boba Fett did a lot of callbacks to Boba's background, specifically being a clone of Jango Fett. We saw those flashback sequences throughout the show where young Boba is on Kamino. I mean, they even reshot footage. They recast an actor as young Boba. With a very uncanny resemblance to Daniel Logan, who played the original young Boba Fett. So good job, casting department. But like we saw these scenes, like they were very, I think, intentionally used time and time again to remind us as an audience that Boba has a legacy, and that legacy comes from Jango, and that legacy comes from their shared DNA, but also the teachings that Jango passed on. The teachings of being a bounty hunter, of how to survive, how to defend yourself, how to, essentially be a force of violence, because that's what Jango and Boba Fett are. They're, it's an extremely violent profession, bounty hunting. And, we're constantly reminded of that through those flashbacks in the show. And even Cad Bane, who was at one time Boba's mentor, tells him a couple times, like, you're just like your father, you're a cold-blooded killer, like this is all you can be. And we see Boba, of course, undergoing a significant change. And I think a lot of that comes from, after his near-death experience in the Sarlacc, I think it's reasonable to consider how after surviving that, it's like he was probably reflecting on his father's own death and how early, like his father died at a fairly young age. And I could imagine that would be something that would leave a very, strong impression on him, having to reflect on his father's passing, how he almost died. And they were both on the job, right? They were both in the profession. Like Jango died on the job. Boba nearly died defending Jabba the Hutt's sail barge. So, with him surviving that and kind of losing everything that was part of that profession, like his armor, his spaceship, his fire spray, his shuttle, spaceship, however you want to call it. He lost everything that was such a marker of his identity as a bounty hunter and Jango's legacy. And so starting over, I think it's a moment for him to start healing and healing that trauma that he's carried with him. And what better way to do that than, it was kind of like an opportunity in a way that was handed to him. Sort of a blessing in disguise, right? Like falling into the Sarlacc and nearly dying is not a good thing. Like that is more trauma. Like that has to be like, probably, extremely traumatic to even survive an ordeal like that. But the way I write about it in the chapter, it's like a moment of, the first episode of the series is called Rebirth, and he's coming out of the Sarlacc, and it truly is a moment for him to start living again. Yeah. In a new way.
Baptism by fire. Yeah, definitely. I love that the idea that this near-death experience and re-experiencing kind of how his father died on the job and everything has really kind of put everything into perspective for him and becomes like a life-changing moment for him. And that's I guess easy to forget, when we're hoping for the cold-blooded killer Boba Fett to be back, but I that your section in there really kind of I guess brought it into perspective a little more for me as well, just to kind of see like, oh yeah, that I guess that definitely would, change somebody if they were a real person. And yeah, for sure. So Molly, were you any fan of Boba Fett before the Mandalorian came out? I forget if you may have just touched up on that in the beginning, but did you also read any Boba stories in the past, or like what were your thoughts on Boba kind of before you read this chapter or looked at this chapter?
I definitely had, I feel like the typical fascination a lot of people had with Boba Fett early on, before we knew much. And for somebody who wasn't, the EU wasn't something I ever got into. Like, I started getting into novels and comics after the canon change. So I have like a very weird experience of it. But I remember my brother having a Boba action figure, and I loved playing with it growing up.
Nice.
I played with a lot of his Star Wars action figures, and I always just found him fascinating, again, kind of like as a part of the weird fascination with these helmeted characters I had just from loving the clones and whatnot. And Boba technically being a clone, like in Attack of the Clones, really kind of facilitated that whole thing even more. So he was definitely always really fascinating to me. And of course, once The Mandalorian came out, that grew tenfold before he even popped up in season 2, as I'm like, well, Boba is the standard. Like, he is the one who paved the way for all of this. So my appreciation for his character grew massively. And that's when I started kind of going to the bookstore and seeing like, okay, what Legends novels can I read and whatnot. Sadly, like I didn't get through a lot of them because I was so focused on trying to like keep up with the current canon and like find other kind of materials. So I prioritized other things, but I do have like Tales of the Bounty Hunters on my bookshelf and whatnot. So seeing him come back was really, really cool in season 2. From that first shot at the end of the marshal, I was just like, oh my gosh, like they're really doing this.
Yeah.
This is really exciting. And so I've always kind of like in a weird way seen him as like a figurative father figure to like Din, because like in terms of just their character types, like Boba Fett had to come before like Din could come.
Right.
So it was like really cool to kind of be like, oh yeah, here's like the father's origin story, or like here's the story developing now. And it was super exciting. And as soon as they did the surprise announcement of the book of Boba Fett, I was just so excited. I was like, yes, now we're finally like Boba's going to get his time to shine. It's going to be great. And I did enjoy the series. Obviously, like I feel like the experience most people had is at first they were like, this is not what I was expecting, and not a lot of people respond to that well, of the, oh, my expectations were not met. But there is that undertone of just like showing how this character has been changed by an experience that I really appreciated. And I think it's interesting they had Din's go hand in hand with that, but I'm sure that's something we'll probably get to later. But it definitely made me appreciate his character a lot more in terms of like underneath the armor, which I think is not something people expected, kind of like you guys touched on, and in terms of people wanted that cold-blooded Boba Fett killer that had been, teased in the current canon and then in EU for a long time. The person that, was mentored by Cad Bane, but like an experience like that realistically would change someone enough that just wouldn't be a possibility. Mm-hmm. And I think in hindsight, it was really, really cool to get to explore that part of him, and instead of, seeing him at the surface level of his armor, we get to see him and who he really is underneath it. And yeah, so that's kind of my experience with Boba, is like he was like just kind of the typical figure to me, but I gained a bigger appreciation for him because of how much I love Mando. And I feel like that's always going to stay, is that I'll have this huge respect for Boba Fett and his character, just because I know that my favorite character wouldn't exist without him. And I hope that we get to see him again soon and that he gets, continued proper justice, because Tem Morrison is just amazing. And like the way they built his character, I think that there's still a lot that could be explored.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Having been, quite young, like when the prequels came out, was Django at all sort of a bit of a draw for you, to those movies, or to that movie?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I loved the entire sequence on Camino, which probably also goes hand in hand with loving the clones. But like Obi-Wan and Jango's fight on Kamino was like literally one of my favorite scenes to rewatch. I was obsessed with just Kamino and like the whole vibe of it. It was probably only second to like the arena battle, obviously.
Yeah.
For me as a kid, I could just and Attack of the Clones was my favorite Star Wars movie when I was younger. I loved that movie so much, and like it's kind of funny knowing that for most people that's kind of like the prequel that they like the least, but I just loved that film so much. So Jango was definitely like another figure for me that in Star Wars that I was just like, wow, I'm really fascinated by this character, and I'm sure it had something to do with my fascination that would come with Mando, like, you know, many years later. Especially the silver armor similarities, I think, even kind of like nailed that down even more. So, yeah, definitely like Attack of the Clones had a huge impact on me and Jango in terms of like how I've seen my appreciation for like Mandalorians and just that the whole bounty hunter thing develop over time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Django is always a favorite of mine too. I remember when that movie came out, Django was always just seemed like such a cool like person, you know, like just this. I've always thought to myself, like, how can someone ever possibly be so stoic and serious all the time, and it being that cool to look at, you know?
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so jumping forward in the book a little bit, Jess, I enjoyed all of it, and there was a chapter that really stuck out to me by Gina Marcello called "We're All Equal Here, Women of the Mandalorian," and there was some really interesting stuff summarizing the need for characters like Cara Dune, and you know, of course, sadly, we might not see that character again, as stated in the piece. But I was wondering if you could just elaborate more for audiences on what makes a character like that so crucial these days in these stories, and why more characters like her are needed, and possibly comparing her with the likes of Rey and what makes Cara special in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I certainly want to give credit to Gina, since that is her chapter, and that's absolutely like her articulation about, you know, arguing that we need more characters like Cara Dune in, you know, media generally. But yeah, I think her overall argument throughout this chapter is, you know, we have at the surface level, we look at the show and we see like there's a lot of strong women represented, and that's awesome. Like we always want to see. You know, it's always great to have more female representation, especially in the sci-fi genre that historically perhaps hasn't had the best representation, especially in roles where women can be, you know, aggressive and violent and be on the same page with the male leads of the show. But I think what she's arguing for is like Cara's pretty unique because, you know, she has her own moral agency, like her own moral foundation that she is enacting her behaviors and decisions on. And she sees less of that in characters like Fennec Shand, for example. Fennec Shand, fantastic character, badass, very tough, you know, a survivor. But we do sort of see that she is, I mean, she's Boba Fett's kind of right hand, I don't know, woman, right? We don't necessarily see her maybe, I mean, she does make suggestions like, hey, you know, she's often giving Boba Fett some really sage advice, but ultimately she does sort of defer to him. She acts a lot on his behalf. We did see initially, I think that was Bo-Katan in the series, where she was something of, you know, not central to the narrative. Obviously coming in with a huge backstory and history from Clone Wars. But if you haven't seen Clone Wars, you're not necessarily going to be privy to any of that. And so you're just going off the information that you have in the Mandalorian show.
Right.
But I think one thing Gina does discuss is how we do see Bo-Katan evolve, especially in season 3. She's so much more of a central character in that season, and evolves into a leader of the Mandalorians, like multiple sects of the Mandalorians, not just her people, but Din's people as well. And so I think Gina does articulate how it was really refreshing to see that evolution in the series, that historically has been centered on Din and the women, like the women's roles in the show, all of that kind of ladders up into Din's journey and his moral decision making. You know, a lot of the women, like the armorer or even Bo-Katan early on, they're pretty much there to support Din and Grogu, but mostly Din on his journey. Like they're there to provide, you know, counsel, support him, but really we weren't seeing much development or important decision making from them in terms of kind of being agentic and coming into their own. But I think the series has really evolved, and I think as we were touching on earlier, like Bo-Katan was certainly came into her own in season 3, really rose up to a leadership position, and Din was very much content to just kind of, you know, kick back and support Bo-Katan and support the other Mandalorians. But ultimately, like, his prize is to, you know, basically have a home with Grogu. You know, that's like, I think even the first chapter of the book touches on that, where again it's an homage to the Western, where the hero can finally settle down on the frontier with their homestead and kind of kick back by the campfire with the sunset. And that's ultimately, I guess, what Din has been fighting for. And we'll see how that evolves over time, right? We still got the movie, potentially future more series of the show following the film, who knows? But yeah, we saw the evolution of a show very, very much centered on Din and his journey, and that evolving to, you know, feature more on other individuals, particularly characters like Bo-Katan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I really love Bo-Katan. I thought she was a fantastic character back in the Clone Wars days, and was stoked when I heard that Katie Sackhoff was coming back. And super awesome character. Molly, because you grew up with the Clone Wars coming out as well. When Bo-Katan first sort of came to screens for you, like, how did you like that character, and how have you like enjoyed seeing her character evolve as these stories have come out?
Yeah, I loved Bo-Katan, and like from when I first met her, and I unfortunately didn't meet her back when the Clone Wars were coming out originally, because like I said, there was a time gap where like I missed it because I just became like a busy kid. But when I went back and watched it once it was available on Disney Plus after season 1 of Mando had finished, I was just super fascinated with the fact that she was this really cool, really strong, like Mandalorian hero who had a complicated journey. Like, it's not like she was just always this idealistic Mandalorian hero. She kind of, had to go through these various paths to get to where she got, at the end of the Clone Wars, where she's able to seek Ahsoka for help and lead the siege of Mandalore and take down Maul and whatnot. It's a really, really fascinating journey, and I loved Katie's portrayal of her. And then, of course, to see it all in Star Wars Rebels as well, and how she works with Sabine and getting the Darksaber. I felt like it was super compelling. So I remember when I realized, I can't remember, I don't think I watched this episode at 3 a.m. because I was still in college, but I watched it like right when I woke up. The episode where she makes her live action debut, I was thrilled. It was the best thing to be like, oh my gosh, like this amazing Mandalorian character is finally here in live action. Not that, it wasn't enough in animation, but it's just really cool to see, kind of like, be like, okay, we have in live action now in this story, which I feel like is appropriate for her to show up, is Bo-Katan, and it's Katie Sackhoff. It's so cool.
Yeah.
So to see her really like to arrive in that season, and then to be more important to it later, and to set up what was set up at the end of season 2, I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, Bo-Katan's going to be a big part of the future. Mm-hmm. And it gets more complicated with season 3, I think, especially for me as somebody who like Din is my favorite character ever, in terms of I love her story, and I think that they made all the right choices for her. That it's clear she needed to be the leader of Mandalore and deserved to wield the Darksaber, and like that story had to be told, and it was told beautifully. Like, that story is so entertaining to me.
Yeah.
But then being torn with the small part of you that's like, but do I wish that there had been more for Din? But has he already gotten enough? Like, it's very confusing just because of how the first two seasons were set up compared to season 3. And it's something like I still can't really work through even a year later. I get so confused where I'm like, oh, like this is great, but then this. It's very complex for me. But one thing that is for certain is like what they did with Bo-Katan's character, I'm very happy. And I think that no matter what I would have maybe changed along the way, she would have always ended up where she is now, which is being the leader of all the Mandalorians, because it just makes sense with her history and her character, and I'm very happy that that's what's happened. So yeah. I will always love Bo-Katan. I will always ride hard for Bo-Katan. She's my queen. Like I love her so much, and it's really cool. Kind of like I love the way that this chapter of the book really frames things too, and like touches, you know, and with Kara too, because I always thought Kara was a really strong female character who I really appreciated seeing. That felt very refreshing. So yeah, for in a way like Bo-Katan to kind of continue that for season 3, because obviously Kara wasn't there in season 3, was really nice. You know, as somebody, as a woman who's a fan of this show, I really appreciated that, and also knowing that the cast feels the same way too, because I did get to have a conversation with Brendan Wayne, who is often acting in the suit of Mando whenever Pedro Pascal can't be there.
Awesome.
And he too very much emphasized how much he loved this journey for Bo-Katan and how important it was that she got her time, and that it wasn't, you know, Din's story wasn't infringing on that or taking anything away from it. So it's really nice to see that.
I agree, and you know, as I guess when Clone Wars first came out, for me, watching the first story arc which featured Bo-Katan's sister Satine, she acting as the Mandalore's ruler at the time, and you know, her tragic story with Maul and Obi-Wan and so on and so forth, and seeing kind of the relationship that she has with her sister Bo-Katan, who at the same time has very different ideals on like how to run the planet, and her not being, I guess, the firstborn, you know, the leadership role didn't go to her, but I've been rooting for Bo-Katan ever since Satine died, and you know, Mandalore has been sort of in disarray ever since that point in time, and Bo-Katan is such a natural sort of character to take up the mantle and keep going, like in the family name and in the I guess in the you know, the hierarchy of who the torch goes to next, right? Like kind of like the royal family, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, like her ending up with the Darksaber, uniting the Mandalorians, her having kind of lived both ways, and I think at some point in this book, I forget which chapter it was there, Jess, but there's a point of making a point of what the armorer says to her, of how she's kind of the only one that can unite both or all the people, because she plays an influence in all of their lives, and I love that moment where she encourages Bo-Katan to take off her helmet and sort of be that epicenter, you know, for all of these different clans to come together again.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is in Gina's chapter, and I think it's a really important moment just for two women in the show to have a conversation where they're supporting one another. You know, obviously Din's the hero, he's the protagonist. The story is about his relationship with Grogu first and foremost, but I think a lot of you know, Bo-Katan's evolution and even her burgeoning relationship, friendship with the armorer is really central to what Gina is talking about in her chapter, where, you know, yes, we have these physically strong, aggressive, direct women like Bo-Katan and Fennec Shand, but they're very much enacting their moral agency through a very masculine perspective, right? You know, being very justice oriented to justice, you know, like doing what is right, you know, very guided by a sense of like justice as their moral compass. And we do see that in characters like Din, you know, having his own moral code, and the Mandalorian, the Children of the Watch certainly have their own moral compass as well that they follow. That's sort of their own justice orientation. But we see that we have these women characters, but they're enacting their own moral agency in a way that is typically prescribed to male characters as like highly masculine, I guess, codes that they're following in terms of how they're going about the world and how they're forming these relationships. So I think that that moment, or those other, like the conversations that Bo-Katan and the Armorer have, is kind of, it's I think very powerful, because we're having two powerful, strong women who are building more communal ties through their two very different clans who have been opposed in opposition to one another prior to them coming together and taking back Mandalore. And I think that's a really powerful thing for this series, is to have these two women leaders come together and build this community. And of course, Din was a part of that as well. But that, I think that's what Gina's arguing for, is like, we need more moments like that. We need these women characters not only enacting like a masculine voice, but also having moments where we do see them enact their feminine voice and use their relationships and use communication and, you know, use their networks to build each other up instead of tearing each other down.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Scars on the Inside by Blake Pellman was also a really interesting read, and it dives into the science of trauma and recovery with our brains, and the relation to the Mandalorian, his relationship with droids, and the association of those and his childhood, you know, his near-death experience, losing his family, all that stuff. I never thought too deeply about the moment that he saves Grogu, other than this is a good guy who was making the right decision. And this part really changed my idea as to what was happening in that moment. When he looks down at Grogu and realizes, like IG-11, who's about to, he's about to be the source of trauma in this child's life, and instinctively just destroys the IG unit and saves the child. And you know, the book actually points out, you know, that the very iconic shot of Mando reaching into Grogu's little pod there and having the tiny hand kind of reach up at him, and mimicking sort of, I guess, him as drawing a parallel with him as a child, kind of reaching up for the Mandalorian who saves him from the B-2 battle droid. And just a small fun fact was that the concept art for that final scene in the episode was actually a very thought out piece, and they shot it exactly the way that it was conceptualized prior to the project being done, when they were going through all the design process with Grogu and how this world should look and all that stuff. And it was only recently that I was watching that bonus feature, which talked about that shot specifically, because I got all these seasons now on this lovely Steelbook 4K disc that I've been able to use now. And one of the featurettes was about that. And so yeah, I just loved how it kind of acknowledged that moment and kind of it gave depth to that moment for me, which originally I didn't think, I guess, as much of it until this point. But yeah, I just want to tell you that it was really cool to read about.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite chapters as well, and I really like how Blake discusses trauma. You know, really unpacks it and allows us to better understand a lot of Din's own motivations in rescuing Grogu and his other decisions in the series, and even goes into Boba Fett's as well. And I think that chapter as a whole, I think, really resonates with something you said earlier, Molly, about you know, like Book of Boba Fett allowed us to see the man under the armor. And you know, we basically, like, that show is about it, and parts of The Mandalorian as well are about acknowledging the trauma that Boba and Din have faced in their lives, especially at young ages. Even Grogu himself, right? He was a youngling at the temple when Order 66 happened. So we've seen that in the flashbacks, that it was an extremely traumatic event for him. He barely survived. And you know, I think what you had said earlier, Molly, about like, yeah, Book of Boba Fett, it was, you know, we got to see the man under the armor, and there's a lot of vulnerability with that, right? And I think, you know, I think unfortunately some people maybe didn't value that, because when we talk about trauma and we talk about healing, unfortunately those things aren't always valued in society, right? To be vulnerable is sometimes perceived as weakness or someone has gone soft. Like in Boba's case, everyone's telling this poor guy, like, oh, you've gone soft, or you old softy. But it's like, hey, like this, he's been through a lot. Like, let's give this man a break. And yeah, I think a lot of audiences went into the show thinking, like, oh, you know, Boba Fett's just this cool guy in a suit of armor, and I really don't want to know anything beyond him than a cool guy in a suit of armor. And I think that's unfortunate, honestly, because I think we shouldn't reduce anyone to just like what they're wearing, you know. We are so much more than you know, what we're projecting into the world. There's so much more to us. And I think Boba and Din are really interesting depictions of that, because like they're literally encased in armor from head to toe. And for them, that is a mask. Like that's something they're projecting into the world, which is like, as Mandalorians in general, it's this tough image of, you know, I'm a warrior, I am impenetrable. And then like, if you're a male wearing Mandalorian armor, it's like this image of, you know, masculinity and toughness and aggression. And I think a lot of these things were associated with Boba Fett before we learned more about his trauma and his backstory and his vulnerabilities. And, you know, men should have more space to be vulnerable, even if they wear suits of armor. Like, there should be a space for a Boba Fett who is a badass, who is a killer, but also likes to crack corny jokes. Yeah. Has a fondness for, also has a fondness for, oh gosh, I'm blanking. The creature under Jabba's palace. What is that called? Oh,
the Rancor, yeah.
Yeah, we show him being affectionate with the Rancor, and fans didn't like that. But it's like, why can't we have space for both? Like, men are multidimensional too. They're not always, you know, badass, cold-blooded killers. And same for Din Djarin. Like, we see a lot of duality with him. Like, but I don't know, maybe because Grogu's so cute, and maybe Din didn't have the same baggage that Boba Fett had. Like Boba Fett, you know, people have idolized him since he first appeared in Empire Strikes Back. That's decades and decades of expectations built up. And so maybe with Din Djarin, there's been more acceptance of him having that vulnerability and him having that growth. But I think there should be space for Boba Fett to also be able to do that. And basically what he's building a found family with his allies, with Fennec Shand, with the mods, you know, I think the group of teenagers with basically the cyberpunk aesthetic. People hated them, right? They just tore into that trope, or these kids who are hanging out with Boba Fett, but he's building a family, and Din is also on the same journey. So why can't there be space for Boba to have that as well? So I'm sorry, I just went off on a rant because I really wanted to circle back to what Molly said earlier, because I just thought it was fabulous.
No, I agree. Yeah, go ahead, Molly.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you resonated with that, and I really too appreciated this edition and this chapter, because I've always found like that Din's trauma is something that is both shown in like ways that are really subtle and meaningful, but also it doesn't really get as much appreciation as I think it should, in terms of some people I think don't understand it and how complex the trauma really can be. So yeah, by the end of season 1, he's come to terms with, you know, droids a little bit. There's one droid he trusted who saved his life and sacrificed his life for everybody else too, and that made him a little bit more willing to trust droids in season 2. But, you know, after what he went through in the Book of Boba Fett too, where he's battling these giant droids by himself, and one of them almost kills him until Grogu saves him, I feel like I would also, you know, have some of my droid trauma reignited if I went to a planet that was being run entirely by droids in season 3. Which I have seen people before be like, it doesn't make any sense that he's, you know, aggressive against these droids again when he had all that character development before. And just like, trauma's not that easy. It's not that simple, you know. You can have like a good day and, you know, some progress over time, but if you have another triggering event, or, you know, you're just surrounded by all these triggers, it weighs down, and he's gonna be aggressive towards droids, especially the exact same type of droid that killed his parents and ruined his entire childhood, really. So I've always really appreciated moments where we get to see how that trauma works for him and how it's not always linear, you know, where it's like, oh, he's getting better. There's, you know, this whole episode in season 3 where it's like, he does trust certain droids, but it's not that easy, and he's still gonna kind of kick them around if he can. And one line he says in that episode too is when they get to the loading dock and they see these battle droids, and Bo's like, oh, I haven't seen these since the Clone Wars, and he says, I have, which I think is like, what is that history there? Like, does this mean his home was attacked after the Clone Wars somehow, like regardless of the Separatist droids, or did he like specifically hunt out these kinds of droids to get revenge? I just, that's a whole other thing that I'll table for now, but I really appreciated seeing the complexity of his trauma and how this chapter like broke that down, and the moment where he meets Grogu specifically was really brilliant and kind of added a new light to that. And I would like love to see more analyses of that with other events, such as like, I think what was probably such a traumatic event for him too was chapter 14, the tragedy when like his ship blows up, which was his home for a long time, and then Grogu's taken, and he literally has nothing except, you know, whatever he was wearing, and then the Beskar spear and the shifter knob. I feel like that was a very devastating moment for him that we never really quite got to see him process a lot. Which of course you can't always have storytelling space for all of the emotions, all of the processing, but I just love to kind of like analyze any of those moments and get a look at the vulnerable side of these characters, the very human side of these characters. So I really do appreciate what they've done with Din and kind of making up for what they didn't do for Boba until the Book of Boba Fett, and getting a little bit more of that in that series, and having like Boba's healing from his trauma kind of happening with Din's healing from his trauma of like losing Grogu and being excommunicated from his tribe. I thought that those did in a way go hand in hand. I don't wish that Din's took over Boba's per se, even though I love that one episode. But yeah, I really appreciate the vulnerability. So it was cool to take a look at it here.
Thank you for that. I totally agree. And also going back to what you said, Jess, I mean, about Boba building a family, and you know, like that to me was also something that I guess stuck out here, which was you know, I mean, like, as much as I love Jango, like, he's not a very relatable character, but like Boba, it has now become a relatable character for people, and you know, as a male viewer of the show, like, you know, I totally agree with a lot of that. It's like, it's nice to see a soft side of somebody who is, you know, by origin, by trade, and by his career, like just a total, you know, killer badass character. You know, it's nice to see sort of another side to him, right? And be like somewhat real, because you know, and there's a lot of movies that I absolutely love that aren't Star Wars related, which, you know, have characters like that, and it's what makes those movies great, is like they're relatable characters. And yeah, and like him building a family is also very important, like, because that's something that he's never had, and he's always looked around, and I just think back to Clone Wars, all his times as a young boy, infiltrating the clone cadets to try and pull off the job, which is to assassinate Mace Windu. There's moments where he's around fellow clones which look like him, but he knows they're not him. And there's a lot of times where he has, like, there's one time where him and his bounty hunter group kidnap a bunch of these clone cadets and some of the officials and stuff, and while they're all in captive, like, he goes to give one of them water, and he says, like, to one of them, he says, like I'm sorry, this isn't what I wanted. And Aura Singh has sort of taken over the mission and become a bit more brutal than I think Boba was hoping. And because even though they're not his, like, brothers necessarily, he doesn't feel like these other clones are his brothers. They, by genetically, they kind of are, right? And then when one of the officers says, like, hey, you know, like, you're not like, you know, like, you don't need to be like them, like you're one of us or whatever, something he says, and Boba kind of has this moment of outburst and goes like, I'm not like those two, and then he points to these other two clone cadets, or these clone troopers, like, trying to separate himself because he knows that he's not them, right? And he knows that he had a father, whereas, like, these other people didn't, but that's something that he no longer has. So there's a very, like, soft spot there in terms of like the fact that he's lost his family, and like him trying to rebuild that and like build himself back up again in this show. It's more than just his job. It's more than just his career. It's also like his way of life and something that he's been missing his whole life, which is loyalty from a family and from other people. And that's one of the first things he says to Fennec when he makes his alliance with her is like, I can offer you something that no one else can, and is loyalty. And I really love that moment on the show where he gets into that and he says like, yeah, that's something that I have that no one else does. So yeah, very cool. Seeing him become a relatable character. Go. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I love the quote that he says, "You can only get so far without a tribe."
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that. Some viewers of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, discounting Clone Wars from the equation, have usually pointed out that it's hard to believe for reasons for Anakin's turn to the dark side. And after reading this piece, I thought like, man, it was very enlightening, like shedding some perspective on perhaps like what he's going through with inner scars and like losing people in his life, which makes such strong motive for turning to the dark side for potential power to save the one he loves. And I just thought like this entire ordeal with reading about inner scars for Boba and Mando and all these characters, it's so translatable to these other characters in Star Wars that might not necessarily have surface level, easy to understand motive for doing what they do. But, if you look deep enough into the character and like what that character has potentially experienced in their lifetime, like, it's a little easier to kind of grip, why they're making these decisions that they're making. So I really enjoyed this part of the book.
Awesome. Yeah. And just to piggyback off that, Keely and Megan have a chapter that compares and contrasts Anakin Skywalker's and Din Djarin's attachment styles, which kind of speaking to your point, how you can take some of these theories and start, applying them to other characterizations and story arcs throughout Star Wars, or even really any media franchise that has similar themes to Star Wars. But I, like, on a similar vein, I really enjoyed their chapter because the way they compare and contrast Anakin's attachment styles, having more of an anxious, ambivalent style, compared to Din Djarin, where they have similar backgrounds, right? Where they both lose their family at an early age. They're both kind of reared in an environment that has strict rules and guidelines for ways of enacting in the world, and even to a degree, they're taught to be disassociated or dispassionate, like unattached to others, but yet they end up navigating relationships very differently, as we're well aware, with Anakin's fall to the dark side. So that was another chapter where, well, it was a chapter that I think expanded beyond the universe of The Mandalorian to talk about Anakin's character arc and motivations. And I thought that's another one of my favorite chapters is Wherever I Go, He Goes. Yeah. Fatherhood and male emotion.
Right. Yeah. And that being said, I mean, like, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the show, Obi-Wan struggles a lot with a lot of this like stress and PTSD with Anakin's fall, and I love the concluding thoughts of the chapter being very well summarized. I think most fans of Star Wars, or even anyone who deals with stress or anxiety or PTSD or experiences fears on like a regular basis, should be encouraged by this part of the book. And it'll greatly appeal to sort of Star Wars fans in general, of course, but of anyone really. And it just got me thinking, like, I would love to read another one of these, which focuses in on Obi-Wan and Anakin and their sort of Psychgeist as well, because I feel like that show as well, outside of Mandalorian, really kind of gave depth to a lot of these other characters, which we've seen in the prequels that never really quite got the same emotional effect that we've seen in these season-based episodics. So it was very cool to read about. Here we go. I got another one. Two more things, and then we can wrap it up here, because I know it's reaching just over an hour and a half here. So I enjoyed reading about the Tuscans in this as well, and what were your thoughts on the Tuscans going into these shows, and which are like really the first culture, you know, potentially being depicted as quite savage, and then, you know, Mandalorian and Book of Boba really kind of widening the perspective from the eyes of Luke, Anakin, and Obi-Wan into a different world and how they're perceived. And just like, what were your thoughts on the Tuskens before the show, and how did the show and potentially like editing this book like change opinions about these characters like for you?
That's a great question. So I'll be honest, you know, I think I fell into the camp of people who probably didn't give the Tusken peoples much thought. Like, they're kind of there. They're antagonistic towards Luke and Obi-Wan. We don't really see much of them beyond those first interactions with Luke and Obi-Wan. So they're just kind of there as like some kind of vaguely threatening force. And then, of course, they're in the prequels where, you know, they're just kind of presented as this one-dimensional, very violent group of indigenous people on Tatooine who kidnapped Shmi Skywalker. You know, we see that she's beaten and ends up dying before Anakin can save her and you know, take her out of the Tusken encampment. So, you know, I'll be honest, I really hadn't given them much thought, because in the film, they're just kind of presented there. They're presented as kind of like this violent group of people on Tatooine that we're supposed, as an audience, like, we're supposed to be afraid of them, along with Luke and Obi-Wan and Anakin. Like, we're supposed to identify with their fear and their resentment of these peoples. But, you know, I think Carlina wrote an excellent chapter on the racialization and the problematic portrayal of the Tusken peoples in Star Wars, and how The Mandalorian has done a lot to rectify that. And I think the way she unpacks it, you know, it ties into broader themes and ideas of colonialism in Western culture, where you know, there's this notion of, you know, Western society, especially during the colonial era, where lots of different Western entities were going out and colonizing different lands and treating the people as inferior, you know, treating the indigenous people as inferior to the colonizers. And, you know, we sort of see that with the Tuskens being indigenous to Tatooine. Like, so that literally is their home planet. Ostensibly, anyone else who is not a Tusken, that is a sentient being, is not native to Tatooine. They have colonized the planet. They have populated the planet with all kinds of settlements. You know, the water farming or the moisture farming, like we learn in Mandalorian, that water is sacred to Tuskens. And so if you have non-indigenous peoples populating your home and they're stealing a resource that you deem precious and sacred, like, how are you going to respond? Like, they're responding in a way that maybe to them is very rational. Like, hey, you're on my land, you're poaching our resource that belongs to us, as, you know, as the indigenous people of Tatooine. And so, you know, I think, you know, with changing norms in media and content creation and media literacy, it was, I think, the writers and the whole production crew behind Mandalorian recognized, like, hey, if we're going to revisit Tatooine, this is an opportunity to revisit these peoples, present them in a different light that is perhaps more respectful, and acknowledging that not, if there's multiple tribes of the Tuskens, like, there can be multiple ways of how they interact with outsiders. And we saw that with Din and even Boba Fett interacting with the Tuskens in ways that were different from how the Tuskens treated Luke and Obi-Wan. And like I said, like, to the Tuskens, like Luke and Obi-Wan just suddenly appearing on their territory, you know, if that's like them acting with aggression, it could be a very appropriate response in their eyes, because they have their own territories, they have their lands, and they were encroaching on them. But I think The Mandalorian, and especially how, and Carlina acknowledges this in their chapter, while maybe it's not perfect, it's certainly, the show did a lot to recognize that the Tuskens, you know, they're multifaceted, they're multidimensional, they're not just these aggressive, like savage brutes that they've been depicted in their other very brief on-screen appearances. Like they have a culture. They can bring in outsiders, bring them into the fold, like we saw with Boba Fett. And I guess humanize isn't perhaps the right word because they're alien, right? And I guess in our understanding of the term, like they're not humans, but they have, I think, done a lot to drum up empathy with the audience and get audiences to recognize there's more like as the indigenous peoples of Tatooine, there should be a degree of like understanding their behavior, like understanding if they're going to be violent to outsiders. There's probably a reason that they're acting with violence. Like that may be their only the only thing they have left to use to defend themselves when their territory and resources are being taken. And, just for lack of a better word, humanize them and make them more multifaceted. Right. Because in reality, that's what cultures are. They're multifaceted, they're complicated, and they're not one-dimensional.
Yeah, it certainly makes me rethink a lot of A New Hope because, to I guess, what Obi-Wan says, from a certain point of view, we only saw sort of the aftermath of Shmi being taken and Anakin going and, slaughtering like animals and all this stuff. And, it makes me think maybe there was something going on with Klieg Lars and the Tuskens. Maybe Klieg isn't the wholesome guy that we knew him to be. Maybe there was some sort of feud between them and they were just kind of sending a message, right? And we've all been looking at it from a different perspective. But I don't know. It was just like it was very interesting for me to read this about and to read about this and also the detail of research in this. I mean, it's really it also, I mean, it says so much about kind of the depth of lore, that this kind of has when it references characters like Sharad Het and Kashyyyk and characters that really fans of the old EU would recognize. And I don't know, I had a big sense of appreciation for just like how thoughtful all this was. It's really it's not just surface Star Wars and very deep into the psychology. It's very deep into both. And I just wanted to point that out for people. It's like it's very, very awesome to see references like that being made here. So I gotta ask you about this last part. So the topic of flashbacks at the end of the book was super interesting, and I didn't notice until it was laid out for me here. But almost every single Disney Star Wars story, other than Solo, has some kind of flashback being used as a tool for storytelling. And I just want to ask, the two of you, did you enjoy the use of flashbacks in these stories, and how they presented themselves, and was it? It was a really new thing when Mandalorian first used a flashback, because even in The Force Awakens, it's sort of perceived as like a Force vision. And Mando was the first kind of story to really present it as what it is, which is like a flashback, which is so new because George Lucas never did any of that stuff. So I thought it was a great way to summarize this book and, how important those are to storytelling and how they're presented, painting the picture of traumatic sequences and so on and so forth. And so maybe you can kick things off and then we'll move on to Molly here.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, I think I might be biased, but agree. It's another excellent chapter. As far as flashbacks go, I think this was another aspect that I'm not sure I had really paid much attention to with the aesthetic choices in Star Wars to be devoid of flashbacks for the most part, unless they're Force visions or visions of the Force or possible futures, things of that nature. And so I think with The Mandalorian, it makes a lot of sense to bring in flashback when we have a character like Din, who is a fully grown adult. There's so much backstory we can only learn through flashback. And it's more powerful for us as a viewer to see those scenes unfold. If Din had just offhandedly said, yeah, I was orphaned and my parents were murdered by robots and the Mandalorian showed up and rescued me, I'm sure that could be a very powerful scene, but Din also keeps his helmet on most of the time. So if he were telling that story with his helmet on and we're not seeing his emotions, we're not, necessarily getting those subtle signs of how he's reacting or responding to having to tell that story. That scene, I'm sure it could be powerful, but I think arguably there's something far more powerful about seeing that flashback where we see him as a young boy. We hear the sounds of the missiles blowing up around him. We see the panicked expression on his parents' faces. We hear the detonator that goes off that kills his family behind the blast doors that he's hidden behind. And, we see the Mandalorian show up like these armored angels coming out of the sky. And it's just, that's one of my favorite scenes from the first season is getting that backstory from Din, because it's so powerful. It ties into so much about his character, his motivations, and his ties to the Mandalorian peoples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah. What are your thoughts on those flashbacks, Molly, and just in flashbacks in general in Star Wars storytelling these days?
Yeah, I think I agree in terms of them being very powerful and useful storytelling devices, especially when they're employed in really, really good and creative ways. So like I kind of said before, the thing that really got me hooked on The Mandalorian was the flashback, was the first one they showed when he was getting his first pauldron made, with just the little teases of kind of what we would see in the full flashback in the season finale. And I think it's kind of a shame that we haven't gotten any more Din flashbacks since season 1. Granted, we've had some, I think in season 3 we had Grogu's flashback of Order 66, but like otherwise they haven't really used them a lot again, which as somebody who wants more and more of Din's backstory, I'm like, please, like, let's do another. Yeah. But yeah, I think in The Mandalorian, I agree, it's very brilliant, and it gives you such a deep understanding of why this character is the way they are, just based off of this one experience that has defined their life. Obviously in this case for worse, it was not something that should have had to happen to this poor child, but he's making the best of it by trying to rescue another child and give that child the life that he might have always wanted, or that he thought he might have gotten if his parents had survived. So I think it's perfect, exactly the way they used it in that show. And as they've continued to use flashbacks in other shows, I think that they've also, served a very similar purpose. I appreciated they couldn't have done the Book of Boba Fett without flashbacks, for sure, because there was a lot of context we needed to fill.
Right.
I think those were definitely like heavier weighted flashbacks in terms of they were long, but it still served the narrative purpose. It told us about Boba's journey and why he's different now, what changed. So I really enjoy the use of them. I think that I'm a big fan of it. And, I'm not sure what to make of what that would translate to in a movie per se, using more flashbacks in movies. I think Rogue One did a really great job of it. And then in the sequels and whatnot, I think you're right. They definitely had a Force kind of undertone. So I'll be curious to see if it's something that, with the Mandalorian and Grogu or the New Jedi Order, if they continue the pattern or not. But I think it's promising how it's gone so far.
Awesome. Okay, quick small question for you, Jess, and then I'll wrap things up here. I'm sure should have been, maybe I should have started with this. I'm sure there may be an interesting story about the cover, because it took me way too long to realize that the cover is actually an action figure. And I just wanted to ask you about that, and if somebody took this photo for the book, or if it was just something you found or what.
That is a fantastic question, and I honestly, I'm glad to hear that it took you a while to recognize it was an action figure, and it's a really well done shot.
Oh yeah,
definitely. It's my Rachel, actually, the series editor. She thought it was cosplay, and I was like, no, Rachel, that is definitely an action figure. When you look closely, I've seen enough cosplay, I guess, to differentiate between them. So the story is, it's not a very exciting one. It's just, we wanted to use images from the actual show, but Disney / Lucasfilm shut us down. Rachel reached out and requested, like, hey, we're publishing this book. May we have permission to use some officially licensed photos from your media package? They declined. So we used this beautiful image from Unsplash, which I guess artists and photographers upload like copyright free licenses to download and use photos from Unsplash for free, including for commercial purposes. So the photo is attributed to Michael Marais, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Michael, wherever you are, thank you for this beautiful shot. It's on the cover of our book, and we love it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you both for coming on. I mean, it's the book was excellent. There's been so much chat about it. I really had to chop down just like kind of what I was going to write down in my notes here. But yeah, I would encourage all listeners to check it out, to give it a read. There will be a link down below for the PDF access and for the physical copy to purchase page. And the next big chapter in this era will be The Mandalorian and Grogu, which is a theatrical release, first in a while. And Molly, I know you've written about this. Can you provide your insight on what you think that story is going to be about, where you think that those characters will go?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most sense, based on the title, is we're going to be focusing on Mando and Grogu again. I think, the shift to focusing on Mandalorian season 3 was necessary, but I do think that in hindsight, they're a little nervous about, focusing too much on it again. So the title alone really does seem to say, okay, we're going back to Din and Grogu and their adventures that you all love. So based on what season 3 set up for them with this independent contracting under the table for the New Republic, is really going to be them just running these little jobs until maybe they run into this big kind of conflict or this big person where they're like, oh, this is not something we can do alone, or this is not something that's going to be easy, and it gets them tied into the New Republic even a little bit more. So I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of it, Din is kind of more into the cause than he maybe thought he was going to be, and that's what gets him to be him and Grogu both to be given main characters for Dave Filoni's movie that will be after, with everybody. Mm-hmm. So that's at least what I'm expecting, is definitely like Din and Grogu versus the Imperial Remnant on behalf of the New Republic, but very much a focus on the two of them as compared to, a bigger story of Mandalore. Though I do think Mandalore is still going to be very important, just based on everything they set up, and that in a way, like, this movie will kind of have a shift of the Mandalorians being what the Jedi used to be in Star Wars movies. Like, they're going to be the heroes of this movie, and Mandalore is going to be very important, especially given how scared the Imperial Remnant was of the Mandalorians at the end of season 3 when they found out a resurgent Mandalore was going to be happening. They were not happy. So, and we've still got the Mythosaur prophecy to deal with. That Mythosaur is still there. So definitely a lot of loose ends, but I think, just in summary, like, just get ready for some more Din and Grogu adventures. Nice.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And how can people follow you again, and where can they keep on top of your news?
Yeah, I'm most active in the fandom and everything with just my Twitter or X, which is Molly Brizzell, just super simple. And that's really where you can see a lot of me talking about either Star Wars or my writing. So
yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. And Jess, thank you again for the copy and your insight on these characters, and congratulations again on the publication and your doctorate, of course. And where can people follow you and perhaps follow up with any questions more about the book and so on?
Sure, yeah. And thanks so much for having me. It's been a blast. I do periodically post on X as at Jess Tomp. That's Jess Tomp. I'm on Instagram at Questing for Adventure. If you like cosplay photos, I have a Mandalorian, custom Mandalorian.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. You got some photos somewhere on there?
Yeah. I'm just starting to actually post cosplay on Instagram, but I did recently do a photo shoot in my Mandalorian armor, so those should be up soon, actually.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I got to try and check those out. Sweet. Well, yeah, thank you both again for the chat about these characters in this book, and always such a pleasure to have each of you on. And when more Mandalorian or Boba Fett chats come up, I hope you both will be able to join us again.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you both, and we will catch you in a later episode. All right. Thank you so much to our audience. We really appreciate if you guys left a review or leave 5 stars. It really helps us out. Really helps the search algorithm find Star Wars Escape Pod in the cloud of podcasts that are out there. So, it really does a lot. And as you know, it's pretty much the only way it helps out, since this is unmonetized and ad free, of course. So, of course, we do love to hear from you. So definitely follow the socials of our guests today, and also our handle is at SW Escape Podcast. The email is swescapepodcast@gmail.com, and I will leave a link in the description below for the physical and digital copies of the Psychgeist of Pop Culture, The Mandalorian, via the ETC Press site, which will be down there. As well as the social handles for Jess and Molly. Future episodes on the show include a What Happened of Asajj Ventress, of course, with her showing up in the Bad Batch. We got to dive deep into kind of where her story went and where it's potentially going. So we'll be going over that potentially before The Acolyte hits Disney Plus in a few weeks. Which we are all very excited about. The premiere happened this past week, so you can look that up, look at the photos online, and we'll be doing after shows for The Acolyte, starting with the first 2 episodes, which premiere on the same day in the next month, in a few weeks, and we'll be going on from there. May the Force be with you guys, and we will see you in the next episode of Star Wars Escape Pod. Take care.